As a PhD student who's researching on compliance with domestic laws and regulations of um, compliance with domestic laws and regulations by diplomatic and state officials in the context of diplomatic immunity and privileges of diplomatic agents and state officials. Looking at the recent happenings and the discussion with between Trump and the Israeli Prime Minister, one would want to cast one's mind back to what is actually obtainable in international relations or international diplomacy. Knowing that diplomacy is more about negotiations, and we know that negotiation is not imposing one person's will on the other, and that it is also about sovereignty of states. Each state maintaining its own sovereignty, having the ability to choose and decide what they want to do. Now, in diplomacy or diplomatic relations or in the relationship between states, because when we see that states come together to interact, we now say that they have established diplomatic relations between themselves. Okay, so in studying or discussing diplomacy, there are laws that regulate the activity, the behavior, and the interaction between states. Okay, there are lists of laws. There is the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations of 1963. There's also the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations 1961. There is the Charter of the United Nations. There is the Statute of the International Court of Justice. We have the draft article of the International Law Commission. We have we also have the we also have the not this one. There is also the United Nations Convention on Jurisdictional Immunity of States and their property. So all these laws put together form the legal framework when we are talking about international diplomacy, talking about relationship between states. Now, when we look at the preamble of the Charter of the United Nations, we will see that we, the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and the nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedoms. And for these ends, to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors, and to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security, and to ensure by the acceptable acceptance of principles and the institution of methods that armed force shall not be used save in the common interests and to employ international machinery for the promotion of the economic and social advancement of all peoples, have resolved to combine our efforts to accomplish these aims. Very clear. Like my principal will always say, that law is very straightforward. These are circumstances where armed forces can be employed when we're talking about international relations. Nations that have now come together to say, okay, fine, let us see how we can maintain world peace, equality of all persons. Now, when we look at this discussion or this conference that or Trump's recent statement, okay, and the questions that have been asked. Okay, now talking about one of these laws, the Statute of International Court of Justice. Okay, now when you read that statute, you see that it is also based on the provision of the Rome Statute. So under that Rome Statute, act of aggression is a crime. Because there's no way you interpret international crime under the Statute of International Court of Justice without referencing that Rome Statute. Okay, so if Donald Trump wants to step into another territory and take it by force, that will qualify as an act of aggression. Now, he was asked a question whether he would involve the military, the army, armed forces, and he said where it is necessary. So where he goes a step further to involve or make use of armed forces, that qualifies as an act of aggression. So you may be wondering what actually qualifies. There are examples. There are four examples I will give as acts of aggression. One of such example is where a state invades or attacks another state's armed forces or another state's territory. A state uses its own armed forces to invade or attack another state's territory. That is an act of aggression. Or where a state bombards another state's territory using its own armed forces. So if Trump decides to say, okay, we want to take over Gaza and we are going to use our own armed forces and we are going to stay in Israel to do that, that is an act of aggression and international law frowns against acts of aggression. Another example is a state allowing its own territory to be used by the armed forces of another state against a third party. That is also an act of aggression. Okay? Now, US is a member of the United Nations. So, US is a state, a member of the United Nations. So, if US, that is a member of the United Nations, will stand on its own and violate the principles of international law, that is like sending